backstory is that Pat Price, one morning he comes into the SRI offices and throws down a stack of papers on Hal Puthoff's desk and said, I got bored last night and I decided I'd explore the planet to see if I could find any UFO bases. Hal is astonished, and of course he had to report this to his CIA handlers. And so there were 4 bases he reported on. One was in the Pyrenees, one was Mount Hayes in Alaska, one was Mount Seal in Australia. The final one was in Africa, and it's a name I can never reproduce. So when I remote viewed Mount Hayes, 2 of us reported this cavern kind of thing, strange objects being worked on. I drew a sketch, which I didn't see Pat's stuff until 10 years later, maybe 15 years later. And I had no idea, but my sketch matched his sketch of the UAP. And so there was some confirmation that some of what Price had reported might be accurate.
Typically, I forego introductions, but you have had such a remarkable career in the military that I just want to mention a little bit before we get into it, so our audience knows where this conversation is going, and some of your incredible credentials and long resume with the military and with the remote viewing. So besides your tour at Fort Meade, your military assignments included Arabic linguist, electronic warfare operator, strategic intelligence officer for Special Forces unit based in Germany, Mideast desk officer, tactical intelligence officer with the 101st Airborne Division during Desert Storm Shield, strategic intelligence officer in the Collection Directorate of the Defense Intelligence Agency, and chief of the Intelligence and Security Division for the Military District of Washington, from which you retired back in 1996. I just thought that is worth mentioning, so my audience has a little idea of what we're going to get into. It's incredible.
Well, it kept me busy for 20 years, so that's good.
I bet, it's so ironic. The biggest skeptic I know is the person who will be editing this podcast, and no matter how many people tell him that remote viewing is real, and that the United States had and paid people to do it for decades, he just thinks it's all a big hoax.
Well, one of my areas of interest right now is a thing called ontological shock, right? I don't know if you've heard the term. It's usually applied to UFO experiencers, so-called abductees.
Abductees, yeah.
Yeah, which is, I understand why they call them experiencers or now. It's easier to say. But ontological shock is where your world view, your sense of reality is shattered by some kind of event or some kind of experience. And a lot of the resistance to accepting this stuff as real, I mean, first, to be fair, there's a lot of unevenness in the evidence overall for paranormal things. But it's not nearly so uneven for remote viewing. But if remote viewing is real, then that shoots in the head a lot of the physicalist beliefs about the universe. Mm-hmm. And there is a certain avoidance of ontological shock in people who refuse to acknowledge it, or at least to consider it, Yeah. So.
Yeah, no, you hit it right on the head. And I have a feeling we're going to be experiencing, collectively, more and more of that as these years and the years to come, and kind of what's been kept under the lid for a long time is slowly starting to.
I have a thought about that, which is very appropriate right here. In a way, all of this arguing about whether UAPs are real, whether abductions are real, all this stuff is kind of getting the general public used to the idea of at least entertaining it. And so if and when it ultimately does prove to be real, the ontological shock collectively will be much less than it would have been if this had happened 20, 30 years ago.
True. And I think that's in part what they're kind of preparing us for with these, with the recent series, and then Spielberg's got his movie coming out, which is going to be a huge ordeal, and it's all about disclosure. So they're seeding the public with something. Now the question is, what kind of disclosure? Of course, that's always the question: is how much will they thwart the narrative so that they can keep us under control, and how much will they allow the truth to come out? But
Or
that's
to what extent will it become out of control?
yeah, and that's another question. Because it is all about control, in my humble opinion. For us, not for them, for us. But I want to get into a little bit about you. So you were recruited out of military intelligence, and how did that unfold for my very small and select skeptical audience that thinks that somehow this whole program was a ruse for the Russians to think that we were doing something that we weren't.
Well, that's like kind of a convoluted story, actually, and there might be a piece of that that's relevant as well. It's kind of a case of us fooling them, fooling us. you know, it's almost a comedy of errors in a way. And a lot of it hadn't been proved, but there's rumors, right? And so the one thought was there's a story, a news account, I think, about them having a psychic on the Nautilus when it did the under the polar ice cap trip that was, world famous and paradigm breaking in its own way.
Mm.
And the Russians, according to this rumor, I get the Russians and the Soviets. It's kind of like isomorphic. The
Right.
Soviets were the Russians basically, with all the people they had conquered back then, and the Russians, according to the rumor, took that to heart, and they started essentially a psychic research program, ESP research program, whatever you want to call it. They call it psychotronics, but they started this program, and then we discovered they were doing that research, and that scared us. And so the CIA felt obligated, which it was, to
Right.
find out if there's any there, and out of that, Stargate was born. So.
Speaking of Stargate, what was the Stargate program for people who maybe have been living on the moon?
Well, Stargate, and let me emphasize here, because this is a bit of a soapbox for me. Stargate is actually two words, Stargate.
Right.
And so many people make it one word, including some of my former colleagues, just Stargate. The problem there, you get a confusion and ambiguity because we have the movie Stargate, we have the TV series Stargate, which they're reviving again, and which is awesome because I love the series. But you say Stargate, you have to differentiate, and if you run both of the words together like they do, which one are you talking about? And we used to, back in the late 90s, we'd be on these, back then it was email discussion groups or email lists, and got in big fights about it. And every once in a while, somebody would pop up and want to ask about Colonel O'Neill or that kind of thing, and we'd say, you're in the wrong Stargate, guys.
Wrong one, wrong chat.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I was supposed to tell you what the program was. Okay, so it didn't used to be called Stargate. It started off and it had a bunch of names over time, but overall, you could say the idea of Stargate was that it captured the government's research and application into extrasensory perception as a intelligence collection tool, and little ancillary thing from that. It was called Scan8 originally, which was a combination of scanning by coordinate, which wasn't a very good descriptor of it. And then when the military got on board, it had various names like Gondola Wish and Grill Flame and all this stuff. That you have all of these incongruous sort of nicknames to throw any enemy or foreign intelligence collectors off. And the final name was Stargate. And so it's come to stand for the entire program.
Right. Kind of like MK Ultra has come to stand for the mind control, even though it's had 6, 7, 8, predecessing names. And so the government, ironically, even at this point, the government narrative and the history that they teach anyway, of course, this is been thoroughly. The truth about this has come out many times over, but the official government narrative is that, well, we looked into this whole psychic thing. It wasn't successful, so we moved on. So as a person who has a very particular vantage point inside the system, how accurate is that story? That they just kind of looked into it. It didn't pan out.
Well,
What?
so the program does have a checkered history. Not because they weren't finding things out that were real about it, but because you got the detractors and the supporters, and you had the skeptics and the true believers. You had these two poles, and it was pervasive throughout the entire history of the program. And both sides probably got carried away. The true believers, there were a lot of really concrete thinkers that supported the program. I don't want to dismiss those guys. In fact, there were a number of really prominent and respected senators and Congress folks who were really supporting the program. But we did have some folks who go out and push the envelope and promise more than they could deliver, and the program could deliver. And and that was a problem on that side. But then on the other side, you had the detractors, the skeptics, and some were just mainstream scientists, or at least tied into mainstream science, who wouldn't believe anything about it, even when they were confronted with real evidence. General Odom, I forget his first name at the moment, he became the Army Assistant Chief of Staff for Intelligence, and he's the one that got the program kicked out of the Army at the time because he just wouldn't believe it was real.
That's right.
He went on to run NSA and was, by most accounts, the worst NSA director they ever had. But, I digress.
Obviously, his judgment has not.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What the main, the nail in the coffin was actually when Congress decided to give the program to the CIA effective 1995, and some folks in the CIA were very interested in it, but CIA was being run by. I should have looked this up because my early morning synapses aren't working very well. Well, it's being run by a guy who's formerly had a doctorate in some sort of nuclear physics or something,
Right?
And he didn't believe in this stuff at all. In fact, he was famous for having kicked people out of his office when they came to brief him on the program. He wouldn't even take the briefing. He'd just say, "Get lost. I'm not going to waste my time with this."
Not biased at all.
No, not at all. And so when Congress tried to give they succeeded in giving the program to the CIA, but they didn't succeed in keeping it alive because at that point the CIA said, "We don't want this." And so on,
But the CIA had a little beef with the program at that point. Was.
Say again?
Didn't the CIA have? I mean, even though there was aspects of the CIA constantly using and involved in the program, both before and after they declared it unworthy of funding, wasn't there a kind of I want to say like a up yours going on between Congress and the CIA at the time, which did not help the situation with you guys. Like maybe there was hearings or something, and then they were like the CIA was pissed because they were airing all their at least not all of it. That would be impossible. We would need centuries for that. But they were airing some of their dirty laundry out, and then the CIA was not happy about that, and so they, to kind of, I don't know.
I'm not sure if that's the scenario at the time. That did happen, although the first instance of that was way back in 75.
That's right, after the church hearings, right?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
That's called the CIA, the rogue elephant of the intelligence community. And of course, they were into a lot of mischief. CIA was into a lot of mischief back then. At this time, I think if they were upset with Congress, it was because the Democratic Clinton administration, the Republican Congress, were eviscerating the intelligence community. The Cold War was over, right? And so they were cutting massive chunks out of the budgets for these agencies. And of course, they weren't happy about that. But that, in a way, contributed to the demise of Stargate, because the CIA didn't really want the program, but they wanted the program because it came with 12 personnel slots. And And so they brought it on board. They accepted it, and this was June 30th, 1995. They accepted the program, and at the very day that they accepted the program, they also shut it down. And then they took those 12 personnel slots and they passed them out throughout the rest of the agency, doing other things than what Stargate was doing. It was fairly cynical. But now, of course, they had to justify to these powerful senators and Congress folks, justify shutting the program down. So they closed the doors on the program on June 30th. In July, they commissioned the American Institutes of Research to do a deep analysis of the program to justify shutting it down. So they shut it down first, and then came up with the excuse for shutting it down after the fact. You don't get that sequence when the media reports on this, right?
Right. Of course.
And the report itself was cooked. You know, in intelligence community, when you have data that isn't really data, it's been massaged to report something that the person who massaged it wants to report.
Right.
Which we see happening a lot in the Trump administration right now.
Certainly.
Anyway, it was cooked. So they only investigated certain aspects of the program. Well, I'll cut to the chase here. There were roughly 250 scientific projects, in research projects involved. They only looked at 10 of them, the last 10 that were done. We did, at Fort Meade alone, we did somewhere near 3,000 operational remote viewing sessions. In other words, sessions intended to collect data against foreign threats. They examined 40. And from that data, they claimed that it was of no use. And therefore,
and they probably handpicked the 40 to prove just that.
As a matter of fact, they did.
Wow.
So it was just it was a totally bankrupt study and final report, clearly used to justify shutting the program down. In fact, they released the archives. Ultimately, CIA released the archives, which constituted of going in to the Stargate offices, and we had 13 5-drawer security containers, 5-drawer safes, which amounts to a lot of data.
Yeah.
And they went through that. They didn't go outside of that, like to what used to be called Stanford Research Institute, or SRI International, which was the organization that did the research on it. They didn't go there to get any more of it to declassify. They just did our offices. They still came out with about 100,000 documents, give or take. A lot of paper. Right. Certainly nowhere near the Epstein files, but still, plenty to go through. They finally declassified that fully. It became available to the public marginally in 2004, and then more fully, more recently, where it's all on their website. But they redacted all the stuff that described successes. You know, all the
like targets
positive,
and
Yeah, well, and they didn't, like, for example, the targeting, they didn't reveal what the targets were. So it's impossible to know how well we did in relation to describing those targets.
Wow.
Then, in addition, when we got customer evaluations, what a miracle, all of the positive customer evaluations were redacted, and all the negative ones were there in their glory, you know. So it clearly was engineered to make Stargate look like a failure. And I don't think it was cynical in the sense that they wanted the slots, but they didn't want to run the program. It wasn't some kind of conspiracy thing where they wanted to smother this idea that people can be psychic. It was more of a administrative purpose than anything else. But yeah,
I mean, the fact that remote viewers continued to be used by every division of the military long after the program was so-called shut down because of its inadequacy or lack of successes, you know, and I'm sure to this day there's got to be at least a portion of people who are smart enough to realize that this works and can work and is absolutely worth, you know, putting people on to find something out, because, you know, sometimes it's all you got. You know what I mean? Sometimes there really is no other
Yeah.
way. And so I don't, you know, it's,
So let me talk a little bit about post Stargate remote viewing in the government.
yeah,
Okay. First off, military services didn't continue to do it. The Army was the only one that had a program.
on
I
record
mean,
anyway, right? Like officially.
yeah, but even then, I mean, the Air Force certainly didn't have a program. The Navy didn't. The Navy toyed with it in the 70s, but kind of left it behind. And but the Army did have a program. In fact, there were two of them, one of which lasted for about 2.5 years, and then they combined them. But then when the Army was forced to get rid of it because the commanding general didn't want it, they it got picked up by the Defense Intelligence Agency, which is an echelon up anyway. So that was actually a better move.
Right.
It was kind of backfired on the general because so his name was Soyster, and he came in and evaluated the program and gave us all a medal and said, we're going to shut this down.
Yeah.
And then DIA, which already was interested in it, said, no, wait a minute, not so fast. If you don't
He
want it, we
probably
want
was
it.
kicking himself all the
Yeah. And
way.
so Soyster, he was commander of INSCOM, the Army Intelligence and Security Command. About 4 or 5 years later, he became director of DIA.
Oh God.
And he comes in and somebody, a guy named Dale Graff was quite important in this whole story. Went in to brief him, and Soyster says, "What?
Right.
Are you still doing that?" No, no, Soyster, you're still doing it.
Right.
And so he had. There's way more to that story too, but anyway,
Did it end? Did he
DIA's
end? Did he try to conclude it, or did he allow it? Did he?
Well, he at that point we had really strong
Yeah.
congressional support, so he wanted to get rid of it, but he couldn't. He tried to starve it to death and had some success in that, but they were forced to actually try to test it out in the counter narcotics area, and it was quite successful. And so at that point, he couldn't shut it down there either. So the solution is move it on to the CIA, where he wouldn't have to do anything with it, right? Although that was really more a congressional action. They didn't really care about Soyster at that point. But yeah, so the question always comes out, well, is the government still doing remote viewing? And I know for a fact that at least as of 2002, the CIA was not doing it.
Right.
And I doubt they would have started a program since then because, I and Hal Puthoff, who was one of the founders of the SRI program, were invited to give some guidance as to how to set up a program at the CIA, which is evidence they didn't have a program at that point. But the people who were pushing it were like third tier executives, which is pretty high up the food chain, but not high enough. They were shot down when they brought this proposal to the deputy director level. They said, no way, we're not going to do that. And so, but at the time we were being trained, NSA had a program. And nowhere did I see that they did away with their program. And there's some suggestion from some whistleblowers that maybe they still have a program. I'm inclined to think they do. I mean, it'd be a great home for it.
Right.
CIA would be a plausible place. I mean, NSA would be a plausible place.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. It sounds about right.
Yeah. But there's also more. This will be quick because I can see you probably have another question. But there's also one more piece. So Dan Brown came out with his newest book, Secret of Secrets.
Oh, I got to get it. I forgot that came out. I got to get it. Yeah.
Yeah. It's an interesting book. I enjoyed reading it. But Dean Radin, and I don't know if you know his name.
Oh,
but,
he's a former guest.
Okay, good.
Yes.
Then I don't have to introduce him. So Dean Radin interviewed Dan Brown. One of the few interviews that Dan Brown does. He doesn't usually do interviews.
Right.
And in the course of it, Radin mentioned that he had reason to believe there was a government program going on, but it's not an NSA program. I talked to Dean last week about this, and it's not a smoking gun piece of evidence, but it's very compelling. And so there may be two programs out there, neither of which are being done by the CIA.
Wouldn't surprise me. It wouldn't surprise me at all. Honestly, I think that there's a part, at least on some level, that understands that there's a danger involved allowing remote viewing to come because of the nature of how corrupt the government is. You know, it's like I feel like that's always being factored in, at least on some level, by the people who are in the know about these programs and how they work. And so, you know, yeah, there's skepticism, which is fine. You know, like I'm not against skepticism.
Hmm.
Healthy skepticism is good. You know, everyone should be critically thinking about things and asking questions. But I do think that if you go high enough on the food chain, the bigger reason why this is not so readily accepted is because they're afraid of what might be uncovered, you know, in this, you know, incredible
Yeah.
ability that we have. And you've been clear that remote viewing it's not, I mean, it's not about belief. It's
Hmm.
about discipline, right? You said that the
Hmm.
biggest misconception people have about it is how it actually works, you know.
Hmm.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
Um, excuse me.
Chemtrails.
So, I'm sorry, what?
I said chemtrails. Everyone's coughing. I'm like,
Chemtrails. There you go. Yeah, chemtrails.
what the fuck?
Well, I could get off. I have a soapbox about that too. We won't go there. That's off topic, but
Maybe at the end. We'll
yeah,
try.
maybe. Yeah. Um, so yeah, one of the big problems about remote viewing is people have these misconceptions about it, right? And I think that's where you want me to go with this question, right?
Yeah, you know, like you've taught,
Yeah.
it's almost, I want to call it a craft. I want to call it, it's a discipline, you know, it does take
Yeah.
practice and discipline. And people think that it's like, well, you know, so yeah, please.
Yeah. So one of the really startling things that SRI discovered in their research with all of this stuff was that everybody could do it to a greater or lesser degree. We have the underlying inborn capability of doing remote viewing. It's part of a much broader spectrum capability we could call being psychic or extrasensory perception or whatever.
Mhm.
And of course, there's two detractors from this. One is, of course, the skeptics who say, no, there's no such ability. We don't have this underlying thing. It's just nonsense. Although the evidence that SRI developed was pretty persuasive.
Yeah.
The other side of it are the people who are the I don't know how to describe them, but you know, psychic sorts, right?
Right, right.
Who tell no, you have to have a gift, a special gift that most people don't have in order to be able to do this. You know, I call remote viewing the most democratic psychic ability there is because everybody can do it.
Right.
They just have to learn the process and develop the expertise and the experience to be successful with it. And now I say just, I mean, there's a lot of work involved
Right.
in that word just there. But it is something that most people can do. And if they have the will, if they have the desire, it's like playing an instrument. If you want to
Mm,
play an instrument, almost anybody can learn it. They just have to put in the sweat equity, shall we say, the sweat
that's
equity to
right.
do it.
It's
Yeah.
like it's like a sport. It's like, you
Yeah.
know, people who learn to juggle 6, 7 objects. It's like, you know, yeah, there's always going to be a bell curve where
Yeah.
people start with different, you know, natural abilities. Some people are more inclined, you know, some people have more athletic ability, but you can teach a kid to be a golfer from the time he's 3, 4 years old, and by the time that kid's an adult, you know, he may just be Tiger Woods. It's like, you
Yeah.
know, was he going to be Tiger Woods if you didn't teach him from that young? Absolutely not. You know what I mean? Like, but the rigorous practice turns into mastery, and people think that when it comes to particularly psychic abilities are so kind of, you know, unexplored scientifically besides like Dean
Hmm.
Radin's body of work, and people have been kind of hypnotized into thinking that it's, you know, well, it's probably all bullshit, and even if it wasn't, how do you study something that's not quite visible, you know? But
Hmm.
so, and you know, I've heard other legendary remote viewers talk about this. You know, it's like Joe McMoneagle comes to mind. He was like, if you're willing to put the time in, you know, you can
Hmm.
get really good at it and consistent. But if you're not, you know, it's like anything else. If you don't use it, you lose it. Is that do you echo that as well?
Well, for the most part, you may lose your edge with remote viewing, but because it's based on something you already have, I don't know that you lose it altogether.
Mm.
In fact, we have this interesting phenomenon called the first time effect in remote viewing. And it usually comes to play when you're just starting out. You often will have really good success the first time or two, and then it drops off. And there's an explanation for all this, but I won't go into that either. It drops off, and then you have to slowly fight your way back up to where you were when you started. But I've noticed that some of my students who don't do remote viewing for a while, they take a break for a few years, whatever.
Mm.
They come back and they have a new first time effect.
Ah.
And then, of course, they go back to having to do the hard work again. So I don't think you totally lose it,
Yeah.
but you certainly do lose progress you had made.
Mm. And it's so funny because it's so controversial. I mean, it's mocked by, you got half the people who I think just accept it like why not? It doesn't conflict with their understanding of reality because
Mm-hmm.
they've had experiences they can't explain. They've come into knowledge they don't know how they knew, and they've experienced psychic phenomenon or supernatural phenomenon, so that they're more open to it. And other people, have not. They're kind of much more five sensed oriented, and they just kind of dismiss it outright and make fun of it. But it's like, why do you think research into consciousness seems to attract ridicule in a way that other intelligence tools don't?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, research in consciousness in general attracts that. I mean, there's this ongoing. Yeah. So I got, after I retired from the Army, I got my PhD in philosophy from the University of Texas at Austin. My wife says I majored in unemployment. But it's been very useful to me, and I knew it would be in the career path I've chosen, which is promoting and teaching remote viewing. There's been this ongoing, I don't call it a fight. You don't really fight in philosophy, but you debate, right? And so there's ongoing debate in philosophy between a physicalist explanation of consciousness, where the mind and consciousness is just a property of the brain. There's some few outliers there. They're called eliminativists, who, that's a hard word to say clearly, but they reject the idea that consciousness is there at all. They say, no, consciousness is just an illusion. Of course, the problem they haven't solved is, what is it that's having the illusion of consciousness if it's not some kind of consciousness, But then there's the other side who think consciousness is a property of humans that's above and beyond physicalist explanations, and they have various ways of interpreting that. The problem is, generally speaking, our world is, a particular scientific world, is based on this physicalist notion, which is that everything in the universe is physical or a product of physical fact. And consciousness blows that out of the window. There's no way to explain consciousness in physical terms. So the physicalists keep saying, well, one day we'll be able to explain it. That's called promissory physicalism or something like that, right? And because of that, oftentimes anything that involves consciousness is considered to be squishy, woo-woo.
Yeah.
It doesn't fit in with our beliefs about this and what we consider evidence for the physical universe and all that. So we're just going to mock it and dismiss it. And then when you get into the intelligence world, that just carries over. Right?
Yeah. Over and over. It's a shame. I feel like we're missing out on so much. And
I'll throw this in there. We are missing out on so much because if the world is partly non-physical, if we dismiss that fact, we will never come to a bottom line in describing the universe. Right?
And we know that the world is, just because it's not our experience doesn't mean it's not a true physical reality. We know that what we're perceiving is virtually nothing, on the grand spectrum. The human body and our eyes and our perception is like 0.000 like 1% of the entire, this little teeny weeny band of the invisible light spectrum, right? Or what do they call it? I'm massacring the
electromagnetic spectrum.
Yeah,
is that what you're looking for?
Essentially, and that the majority of reality is non physical and multidimensional. And science is like, quantum physics is saying yes, yes, yes. And, science is saying, wait a minute, as always, wait a minute, so it's just, it's crazy that it's 2026 and that we're still struggling as a species to understand our very nature that comes with our DNA.
There's a famous philosophy paper by Thomas Nagel called "What Is It Like to Be a Bat?" and in that, this is an argument that consciousness is in addition to the physical world. The idea is that here we are, we perceive the visual spectrum to certain limits. We hear things to certain limits, that kind of thing. You take a bat, they see things we don't see, they hear things we don't hear, and yet we're all in the same domain, right? And so the very fact that we perceive things differently than bats suggests that consciousness is definitely more, at least, than what physicalists want to argue. I'm not making the point of the paper very well, but it's just as an illustration,
Absolutely. I mean, and you could extrapolate that to dolphins. You can extrapolate that to, any number. I mean, even dogs have. How much more do they smell than us? Like something like 40,000 times. They have a greater ability to pick up scents in the air than human beings. I mean, imagine if our nose was even like a 1/100th of that, we would never get anywhere. We'd be like, oh my God, too many smells, But
so what I've always wondered is how did they find that out? Did they survey a whole bunch of dogs and get?
Oh yeah, that's a great question. It's a really good. I guess they do. I don't know. That's a good question.
Well, I think there's. I already know the answer. I just think it's a good joke. But they can analyze their olfactory receptors, and determine what the frequency range is or whatever it is, and when it comes to chemical.
That's right. They do that. They do that pretty well with hearing and with smell. But so, Third Eye Spies, very very famous, incredible documentary that they finally were able to make and put out many years ago. And of course, that tells the story of a very famous remote viewer called Pat Price, and Project 8200. Although I can't remember if Project 8200 is specifically mentioned in the doc, but I'm sure you've heard of it.
No, it's not in there. But go ahead.
Yeah. What can you tell us about Pat Price and Project 8200?
Well, the first thing I want to tell you is that there's differences of opinion as to what happened to Pat Price and his origins and that kind of thing. So Russell Targ's the one who I think he probably produced or funded anyway, Third Eye Spies. And Hal Puthoff, of course, was the two of them together were the ones who founded the SRI program, which went on for decades. And they both tell somewhat different stories. Now, part of that is because Hal was still involved. Now, let me think. Hal had a little bit more first-person experience of the end of Pat Price than Russell did, and so they have different stories. But Pat, here's an interesting thing. So I live here in southern Utah. At 6,000 feet, it's great in the summer. So I live in southern Utah. The two probably most legendary names in the remote viewing saga, Ingo Swann and Pat Price.
Right.
Pat was actually a native of Salt Lake City, Utah. And Ingo spent his formative years in Tooele, Utah, and went to college in Salt Lake. So I kind of feel like I'm part of the heritage,
Yeah.
So Pat started out there, ultimately got into Scientology, and I'm not going to worry about the chronology here, what came first and all that kind of stuff. But he ultimately, he spent some time as a police commissioner and apparently used to go out on the beat with the cops and stuff. And he developed this kind of intuition to know when something was screwed up, which a lot of police officers do, or something was going to go south. And then he, I think probably with some help from Scientology, developed some pretty remarkable psychic skills, if you will. Remote viewing, essentially, he was doing remote viewing. He came in to SRI when there was some news coverage on the remote viewing program.
That's right.
not the government connection, but the fact that they were doing it at SRI. And he came in and volunteered to be a source. And for the most part, he blew the doors off of the
Right.
various targets. It did some spectacular work. And I want to caution people, even the best remote viewers aren't always right. They
Right.
still get things wrong. Joe McMoneagle himself
Mm,
will admit that,
of
sometimes
course.
he's so good when he has a really high success. It's amazing.
Mm,
But he can be as bad as he is good, depending on
mm,
the circumstances, right? Which is not is typical.
right.
Yeah, and so some folks out there give you the impression that remote viewing always works. Well, it doesn't.
Right.
Um, and when we're dealing with a human skill that we don't know the actual causality, we don't know how the signal gets from one place into your head, right? We don't know how that works. We have hypotheses that might
Mm,
be the explanation. We don't know how it works. You would expect that you would have false positives at times. You'd have
sure.
successes, you'd have mistakes. And Pat was like that too. He was so good that ultimately the CIA actually hired him directly away from
That's right.
SRI, and he was working essentially as directly as an employee for the CIA at the time he died. So
Yeah. And, there's a lot of rumors that swirled that he was so uncanny that he saw some things that made him a target and a liability both for the CIA and a target for Russian
yeah,
intelligence operatives. And his death was obviously, I think, very suspicious and controversial.
it
Talking.
did. Yeah,
Yeah. Go ahead.
it did have suspicious elements. So and the CIA gets blamed for this all the time. In fact, I think Russell in the Third Eye Spies blames the CIA on Price's demise. I
He at least begs the question to the
Yeah,
CIA, like what happened to Pat?
yeah,
Yeah, what happened to
yeah.
my friend?
I obviously you can't know for sure anything with the CIA, but I think the odds are very low that the CIA did it. Price
Yeah,
was a useful asset to them.
he
They
was.
had no reason to get rid of him. Now, people speculate when they think the CIA did it that he must have uncovered something. That was the theory you
Right.
just mentioned. He must have uncovered something. Uh, well, no, they had their claws on him, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't matter if he did; they had control over him. But what's interesting is 2 weeks, and I heard this straight from his daughter.
Hmm.
2 weeks before Price ended up dead, he said, "If anything happens to me, it was the KGB that did it."
Wow.
Okay. And if you think about it, KGB has assassinated people
Yep.
using, and he reportedly died of a heart attack. But the CIA has this
Heart attack gun.
drug or chemical or whatever, yeah, that
Mm-hmm.
can mimic a heart attack, and they've used it. I
Yep.
mean, did I say CIA? I meant KGB.
KGB. Well, KGB does,
Yeah,
and they've
yeah.
admitted that they
Oh,
have
yeah.
used it. Yeah.
And so that's interesting. Now, Price did have a history of a bad heart condition. And so it all could boil down to the fact that he just died of natural causes. We don't know that. But
Right.
the reason it's suspicious is because when Pat died, an ambulance came to pick up the body and it disappeared for 24 hours.
That's
Right.
right.
And then it's unexpected. Well, I mean, unexplainedly, it shows up in the morgue,
Oh my God.
and
That's
nobody knows how it got there, right?
if that's not a
And so
red
that's where the
flag.
mystery is. What happened? I build this theory that, and I admit I don't know the truth here, but it seems to me that so if you were going to assassinate Pat Price, and this chemical, I guess, does take a little while. It's got a half life. It
Mm,
takes a little while for it to dissipate. You might want to get the body out of the net until
mm,
after that chemical's disappeared and the smoking gun is gone, right? And
yeah.
then, once that's happened, you can get the body back and everything works. I don't know if that's what happened, but I think is a reasonable
Yep. That's
theory to
plausible
have.
deniability right there. I
Yeah.
mean, that's so messed up. I heard they even then they had a KGB who they ended up questioning who admitted, although he wouldn't admit who he used it on, but
Yeah.
admitted that he did have the gun and it was used. And I think it was in the same vicinity that Pat was when he died, which is, you
Yeah.
know,
I haven't
yeah.
been able to track this down, but Hal Putoff, when he talks about this, says he'd heard that there had been a Soviet defector that had been interrogated, a
Oh,
former KGB guy, and the defector had said, they said, well, have you assassinated anybody in the United States, referring to the whole CIA or the whole KGB? And the guy said, no, well, except for that psychic guy.
oh my God.
Now, I haven't been able to track that down.
Yeah.
I'd love to find out where that came from, but
Probably not much record of it, but if Hal's saying
yeah,
it, I bet you he either heard it or read about it somewhere,
yes.
you
I
know?
asked him about it. I said, okay, well, where did this come from? And he said, I am not sure, but
Mm,
the person I heard it from, I felt like was a credible source. So,
mm, yeah.
who
You
knows?
know, here's an interesting question. There's often an occasion where remote viewers encounter targets that don't seem human. What
Hmm.
have you ever had an experience like that? And what can you tell us about those experiences?
Well, usually, unless you're targeted on something like that, you won't encounter that. So,
Right.
for example, if your tasking is a Chinese nuclear test, you're not likely to run into any NHI.
Yeah.
Um,
Or
I have a
gremlins
problem with
or
that term NHI. Yeah, I think it's ambiguous, but I'll use it for now. Okay.
yeah.
Or what? ET. That's the thing. Of course, they switched from ET, extraterrestrial, to NHI, non-human intelligence, because there's a lot, including Jacques Vallée, are a little questioning whether they really are extraterrestrial or just,
Extra dimensional
future
or
humans or
yeah.
whatever. I don't know, but there's an issue. Anyway, whatever. Another sidebar. You got to watch me. I'll get off
Right.
on those, um, but there's been a history of people being tasked on UFO, ET,
Yeah.
uh, you know, anomaly. I call them anomaly targets, and yes, I've done a few of those, not willingly and not wittingly,
Right. Right.
because a remote viewer, if you're doing it properly, you don't know what the target
That's
is.
right. I was going to say that you couldn't have done it
Yeah,
willingly or wittingly because that would have spoiled the
yeah,
results for the most part, right? I
yeah,
mean, the way that,
yeah,
especially the way you guys work, where it's
yeah.
the protocols are very strict. It's not.
Well, you mentioned Project 8200. It's a book published by Skip Atwater. That's his nickname. F. Holmes Atwater, or Fred Atwater, as we called him when we were in the program. Um, let me go back. Let's see. So the backstory is that Pat Price goes back to him. One morning, he comes into the SRI offices and throws down a stack of papers on Hal Putoff's desk and said, well, I got bored last night and I decided I'd explore the planet to see if I could find any UFO bases. Right. Of course, he was self front loaded there, so one
Right.
wonders about that, right? But Hal is astonished, and of course he had to report this to his CIA handlers, so the contract monitors,
Hmm.
because anything weird they had to report to those guys just to keep their funders apprised of what
Right.
was happening. And there was some confirmation that some of what Price had reported might be accurate.
Hmm.
And so, anyway, there were four bases he reported on. One was in the Pyrenees, one was Mount Hayes in Alaska, one was Mount Seal in Australia, and the final one was in Africa, and it's a name I can never reproduce. So, anyway, so there's these four, and Skip ran different people. So what happened is Hal provided copies of all these papers to
Hmm.
Skip out at Fort Meade because he knew Skip was interested in this stuff and was always looking for um, unexpected kinds of targets to run the viewers on to keep them kind of off balance so they didn't get in a rut.
Hmm.
And so Skip ran Joe on all four of these bases, and he ran a number of the rest of us on the Mount Hayes target. And when I remote viewed Mount Hayes, um, Pat called us a maintenance base, and it was a cavern back in the mountain, and they were working on, repairing or updating UAPs, I guess, is the implication here.
Mm.
And Pat, and so Skip had us working on this, and two of us reported this cavern kind of thing, and and strange objects being worked on. I drew a sketch, which I didn't see Pat's stuff until 10 years later, maybe 15 years later. And I had no idea, but my sketch matched his sketch
Wow.
of the UAP, which was confirmatory to me, right, that I was on to something. But anyway, to answer your question about NHIET, whatever,
Yeah.
I encountered these folks working back in here, and I just call them people. I said they're not like regular people, but I'm going to just call them people for want of a better word. And they're working on these things, and I'm going off of memory here, but they were oblong. They look like a tic tac. Essentially, my sketch looks like a tic tac, as Pat's did, although he had a little bit extra stuff on his. But I
So
said
the
these
people
things
look like Tic Tacs or the ships?
no, the things they're working on look like
Oh, okay,
tic tac.
yeah. Okay.
And they're there, and they have intense energies inside of them, and they kind of hovered over the floor, and if they needed to work on them, they moved them one place or another, something like that, just push them around.
Yeah.
Anyway, the impression I got in my monitor said, "Well, what can you tell me about these people?" I said, "Well, they don't want to be here." I said, "It's like military people stationed at a base they don't like. They're there, they kind of hate their jobs, they're bored, they want to go home."
Yeah.
That's
that
kind of the
just
attitude
sucks.
these guys had,
Wow.
which I thought was quite remarkable. In a way, it made them more human seeming
Yeah.
than they might have been, right? So,
It certainly places them on the emotional spectrum similar to
yeah,
ours, like, God, when are we going to get off this freaking rock? These people are
exactly.
crazy.
Exactly.
Oh man.
Uh,
That's amazing. I wonder if you could send us is that sketch that you did, is it public? Is it been like
I've
declassified?
presented at conferences before. I could send you a
Oh,
copy
that'd
of
be
it.
awesome. We could
Yeah.
definitely insert it. It'd be interesting for
And remember, this was actually, I think I did this session in, I want to say 84 or 85. So long before the whole Tic Tac stuff. So,
Wow. Yeah.
yeah.
That's yeah, and Joe has that amazing story about when he was given that envelope by, I think was it Hal Puthoff who threw the manila envelope on him, and it ended up being Mars 1 million BC.
No, that was Skip Atwater.
Oh,
And,
Skip.
that unfolded a little bit differently if you want to hear that story.
Yeah, I love that story. It's
Okay. So, towards the end of Joe's career, at the very end of it, just before he retired, they got a special budget for him to do advanced training, which was, they didn't know what else to call it. But he went down to the Monroe Institute, and Skip would come down, and they'd work on doing some more real world and esoteric kind of targets,
Right.
putting them under the hemisync process that the Monroe Institute used, and in what's become known as ERV, or extended remote viewing, which is a mind awake, body asleep, hypnagogic state kind of a process. And Skip had, now this is another story. So Puthoff had an in with some fairly prominent guy at JPL, Jet Propulsion Laboratories, who were the ones that ran the Mars probe that took the famous photos of the face
Yes.
on Mars and all
Right.
of those. So in 83, 84, Puthoff got copies of all those photos long before anybody in public ever saw
Wow.
them. And he sent them on to Skip to use for remote viewing and
Yeah.
remote viewing targets. And Skip used one of these, and I think Skip knows better than I do, obviously, but I think that it was the pyramid, the famous pyramid on
Yeah.
Mars. And so he used that as the target. And I think it's Skip that came up with 1 million years BC as part of the targeting. I could have that wrong. The book, I think, may explain it in more detail. Again, Project 8200, if anybody wants to get a copy. And then Joe, of course, proceeded to talk about these essentially dead Martians that he could
Yeah.
access, right? And describe them and their circumstances and their situation and what how they ended up dead and all that kind of thing.
Hmm.
And again, it's been a while since I read that. You probably read it more recently than me, but that's kind of the envelope surrounding the project, how it came to be.
Yeah. It's a fascinating story. You know, he was talking about, he was
Yeah,
like, they're like us, but they're big. He was
yeah.
like, you know, and they're not alive anymore. And, you know, it's just like the way that I can imagine being in the room while they, you know, they have this guy spouting this information off, knowing what he's talking about. And he's like, where is this a new discovery? And they're like, just keep going. You know, he was
Well,
like,
if
this,
you're in the room listening to him, I don't know how much you understand. Skip used to joke that when Joe was under, doing an ERV
mm,
session, he talked like he had a mouthful of mush. And
wow.
having listened to some of the tapes, and in fact listened to a couple of the live sessions while he was working, that's a pretty good description.
Yeah. I have a question for you. You know, there was a moment when remote viewing became kind of linked, at least in the public mind, to sensational claims and tragedy like Heaven's Gate. I don't know if you remember that, or even if you were
Oh yeah,
aware that
oh yeah.
there, you know, like from your perspective, what the hell went wrong there, and how much damage do you think that did to, you know, the legitimate push
Well,
for research?
what went wrong is that the people doing it suspended their critical thinking ability. So I'll name names. One of them was Ed Dames.
Mm,
Dames, he started with the best of intentions a company called SciTech. And I want to say it was 89. It was 89 because before I left for Desert Storm. Um, he formed this company. Bert Subelbein, the two-star general that saved remote viewing and then killed it. I won't get into that. Um, but Stubblebine was on it. John Alexander was on the board, a couple other folks, and then he had the remote viewers he had on board included myself, Mel Riley, Lynn Buchanan, Morehouse. I think Dave Morehouse was on board at that time. We all had a kind of a get together, a foundation meeting in his townhouse. I'm blanking on the name of the town. It's over near Fort Meade. So he forms this company, but then as he went along, he just got a bit wilder and wilder with his claims. And then the internet came and Art
mm,
Bell came. And those two things joined with Ed Dames,
mm,
and the whole doors blew off the remote viewing phenomenon. Of course, at that point, it had been declassified, at least the existence had been.
right.
And so Dames is coming on Bell, on Coast to Coast, probably once a week, maybe, or
Wow.
something more often. And he kept talking about the end of the world and all that stuff. And we at Fort Meade had gotten used to his claims. We'd gotten actually taken in on a couple of them about the
Right.
world's going to end, whatever. And we found out, no, it isn't. Right? We're all rolling our eyes when he's coming on the air talking about this
Oh.
stuff. But then he joined forces with Courtney Brown. This was actually in 93, I think. Courtney came and spent 12 days with him, and most of their targets were UFO ET targets instead of
Mm.
ground truth, basic, the kind of target you're supposed to use
The
to
kind of
get your
target you can
skills
actually
down.
prove, you know, a
Yeah,
success with, maybe, you know.
yeah.
Yeah.
So anyway, Courtney Brown then got on Coast a couple of times, and then so this was when Hale Bopp was coming into the solar system, roughly.
Mm.
And somebody, I'm not going to talk about the details here, but somebody faked the photographs and added the photographs of Hale Bopp. They took the regular ones and then they added a feature that looked like some kind of additional planet or
Mm.
astral body that's accompanying the comet. And Courtney takes those photos and he called them professional remote viewers. I'm not going to question that, or maybe I am. But anyway, to remote view this, and he comes on Coast, and he says, "Wow, you'll never believe what I found out. Hale Bopp is being accompanied by a planetary-sized spaceship that's bringing a message to the leaders of Earth, to change your ways or whatever, some kind of peace,
Right.
message of peace or whatever. And it's coming, and I'll keep you updated, whatever. And then, like within a day or two of that broadcast, Coast to Coast, where Courtney's talking about this planetary-sized spaceship, Heaven's Gate, who were sort of a UFO cult, I guess you could call them. I don't know. They all drank, I think it was cyanide, dressed themselves in purple jumpsuits and drank cyanide, and 36 of them, I think, was the number, died. Something like that. My facts are a little garbled by time. But they died, and their scenario, what they're trying to get on a planetary-sized spaceship that was in the solar system,
God.
matched Courtney Brown's scenario so closely that
It got bad press.
Art had Courtney back on to hold his feet to the fire, and Courtney just tried to come up with all kinds of weaselly explanations, and essentially, in the middle of the show, Art Bell kicked Courtney off of Coast to Coast, and as far as I know, he's never been on since. So, so Courtney got linked inextricably with the Heaven's Gate pact, and
Well, he shouldn't have. I mean, maybe his intentions were good. World peace is always something that we're trying to convince our leaders is a good thing, although they're not listening at all. But still, that's just wild how that is taken, and then even if that is the case, how does that translate into wearing a purple jumpsuit and committing suicide in order to, you know what I mean? Like, it's just.
Well, there's obviously a separate trajectory that involved these folks' belief structure,
right?
And they had, and whether there's ongoing debate whether what Courtney said had anything to do with them committing or not. I don't know we'll ever know the actual bottom line to that, but they maybe that was a catalyst. Maybe Courtney was a catalyst.
Yeah.
Maybe they were headed there anyway, but.
Do you think they definitely heard what was said and it had an influence?
I don't know.
Yeah.
I can't tell you.
Just wondering
but
what you
the fact
thought.
that they were trying to get aboard a planetary spaceship that was coming to Earth, and Courtney was talking about the same thing. I mean, I suppose it's always true that the reverse was he heard about that, and then he didn't know what they were going to do about it. But I don't know. I don't know. But the correlation is so strong that it backfired for Courtney really badly.
You got to be careful what you say, especially when you're on the air.
Yes, exactly. So I probably got myself in trouble 3 times already. I don't know. But
well, speaking of that, you're a retired military officer. Obviously, classification is a serious thing. How can we understand that what you're able to talk about today is true, and what changed and kind of what hasn't with that? How strict are they when it comes to, like, you guys actually speaking about some of the truth of what you experienced in the programs? Like, you ever got a knock on your door by the Men in Black being like, "Hey, stop talking to people"?
Well, see, let me explain that. It would be very unlikely that they would try and push back on anything that I would say about the remote viewing program. Whether it was true or not. And that's because if they did, that would be admitting that there really was substance to the program, which they can't afford to do now that they've essentially hung themselves on that goalpost of it being useless, right? If they were to come down hard on me or any of my other colleagues about that, essentially they'd be undermining their entire narrative.
Yeah.
And first of all, I don't think they would want to do the second thing. I don't really think they really care anymore, frankly.
Well, they got bigger fish to fry right now, that's for sure.
Yeah.
They're trying to put out about 3 million fires, maybe.
Oh, man. And the fires just keep sprouting, don't they?
Yeah.
Most of them would be avoidable. But there's another soapbox we don't want to get me on. So,
why do you say that, though? Most would be avoidable. How would it be avoidable? What do you mean?
Well, how political do you want to get here?
I mean, let's get political, man. I mean, I would love to hear what you think.
So there's this cascade of causal things that have happened, and it started with Afghanistan. Right? I mean, there are other things too, not just this, but I'm going to focus on the thing that I'm probably, next to remote viewing, probably have the best insight on.
Mm.
Started with Afghanistan. When Trump negotiated with the Taliban without involving the Afghan government, I mean, this is like negotiating with the Nazis without
Wow.
involving the Brits, right, during World War II.
Right.
He negotiated with the Taliban without involving the Afghan government, essentially surrendered Afghanistan
To
under
those
certain
people who
time
were
periods
fighting.
to the people who were trying to take it over. And so it didn't happen on his watch because he was out of office while all the things started to build and came to that point. And then Biden gets in office, and
Or whoever that
people will
was.
say when I criticize Trump, they say, "Well, why do you love Biden so much?" I say, "I don't love Biden either."
Right.
They're both two of the worst presidents we've ever had, right?
Mm.
So Biden comes in, totally panics, pulls us out, in a rout. Literally, we came out of there just like we were being routed by the enemy, and the country collapses overnight. Of course, they blame the Afghanistan government on that, and there is some reason for that. But the real reason is because Biden screwed it all up, you know.
Mm.
But here's the problem. Here's Putin over here. He's watching it, and he's been kept at bay for years because he's worried the United States will intervene in any kind of nonsense he tries to perpetrate. Well, he sees this happen. He says, the United States is not going to.
They're obviously disorganized right now.
Yes, exactly. And so that's why he pushed the invasion of Ukraine, which he's been working on for decades.
Right.
The first big part of it was when he invaded Ukraine in 2014. Of course, he had this false flag operation. He had the men in green, and they were essentially Russian regular military units. They just weren't wearing their shoulder patches to show they were Russians. Everybody knew they were Russians. He comes in, takes over Crimea, and then in 2022 invades Ukraine. Okay, but see, around the world, people are saying the whole world order is being totally undermined. It's not the way it used to be anymore. It's chaos. We are living in an age of chaos.
Yeah.
And folks are taking advantage of that.
Yeah. I mean, look what's happening in Gaza. I mean,
well, yeah, Hamas and Hezbollah. Now the Israelis aren't quite so functionally illiterate as the American government has been for the last couple of terms. And they finally said, we can't put up with this anymore. And yeah, I admit that they've actually been pretty extreme in how they've handled the Gaza thing, but part of that's Hamas's fault.
Yeah.
So
I mean, I think everything, like everything that goes on, it's all orchestrated and allowed, for maximum casualties. So I'm always hesitant.
Well,
I don't blame 19 Arab hijackers for 9/11 because I know that they, whatever people were involved certainly wasn't pulled off by Osama bin Laden, the longtime friend of the Bush family. The bin Ladens and the Bushes go way back, and then
well, the
19 Arab hijackers,
Osama maybe not.
a couple of whom are still alive, ironically.
Well, we could get into a real discussion about all these conspiracy theories. I don't think that's where we want to go at all.
No, it isn't. It isn't.
But our world is a real mess because of the way the U.S. administration, both the Trump and the Biden, and somewhat Obama as well. I mean, Obama is what got the Arab Spring going, and then didn't support it.
Yeah,
so
we have a long history.
We're in a mess because of that's just part of it. That's not the domestic side of it. So anyway,
no, our foreign policy has been a global, catastrophe for quite a while, not for American industrialists and their partners overseas, but for other countries around the world, sadly, and that's bad karma. And Americans in general are, just catching wind for the most part of the kind of chaos and damage we've done. But like what, we don't, there's many ways to do things, you know what I mean? Like, and I don't understand why we can't simply there's always a win-win. It doesn't always have to be, we're just going to take everything and you can have the scraps, or we'll just blow you up or take you out. There's a middle ground, that our foreign policy has decided, it is not true to this corporate, cutthroat capitalism that has become the freaking mantra of American industrialism. So it's just crazy to me, that it's still going on. And We're still doing it. I mean, we went into Venezuela because we didn't like the dictator. Yeah, okay, sure. All of a sudden, we give a shit about dictators. When the dictators are friendly to America, we love them. You know, they're great.
Mhm.
We just had one in the White House a few days ago, didn't we? You know, a couple weeks ago with that one terrorist guy who they welcomed in for a dinner. It's like
I'm not sure which one that was. There have been so many, but
yeah, I know. That's that's the craziest part.
oh,
You
you might
know,
be talking about the guy in Syria. Is that the guy
yes,
you're talking? Yeah.
yeah,
So for once, I think they did something right there. Now
maybe.
he does have a terrorist history. I mean, was it ISIS? Well, yeah, I think he's part of ISIS at one point. Anyway, he has a history, but I think he really is making a good faith effort to bring Syria out of that, and we want to reward good behavior,
Right,
right?
right.
With Maduro, it clearly wasn't to get rid of the dictatorship because they wouldn't have left all those other folks in,
Yeah.
right?
No
And
shit. I know. Yeah.
and it wasn't about narcotics either,
No, I
because
know. That's so.
Trump pardoned two narco
Yeah.
traffickers, right?
Like literally,
Uh,
just
one
not
of them
long
was
ago.
Guatemala, was it? He was the president of, I don't remember which one it was, one of those Latin American countries.
Yeah.
The guy was clearly a convicted narco trafficker, president of the country, exactly like Maduro.
Mm.
And so he goes in, kidnaps Maduro, and turns the other guy loose. What's going on there? You know?
It's called oil. It's called
Well, I think that's the
treasure.
case. I
Yeah.
think that's the case. Although he apparently didn't consult the oil companies because they really don't want anything to do with Venezuela right now.
Wow.
So, except for
Wow.
one, there's one of them that thinks they can do something with it, but the rest of them say, "Why would we want to go in there?"
Well,
You
right.
know?
Yeah, I'm sure.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's like you
Yeah.
got to stop and wonder who's making the argument for what and what's really the motivation, because it's like it's such a shit show. It's like
Yeah.
it's chaos. It's like you said, but
Yeah.
you know, what we'll have to do is we'll have a sequel to this podcast where we'll get into the weeds about some of this shit and some conspiracy theorists theories and talk about, you know, some of this, because, you know, there's two sides to every coin. You know, there's people
Or
who
maybe
insist
there's 6 or 7
six or
sides.
seven. That's more
Yeah.
accurate to
Yeah.
say. Absolutely. You know, because there's people who say that NATO really went out of their way to provoke Russia and to
Oh,
try
that's
to get him
bullshit.
because they've been waiting to kick the military industrial complex into high gear, and then they have more money to launder, more funding.
That's Russian propaganda.
Yeah, but what about all the money that's gone missing to Ukraine?
There
Like-
not all that money going missing in Ukraine. That's
They
Russian
said
propaganda
last I checked, there was
too.
something like $50 billion unaccounted
Yeah,
for.
that's not true.
But that's
and-
what
and neither
Zelensky
is-
said.
Huh?
That's what Zelensky said.
I would have to hear the context on that.
We'll see if we can find it. Put it
Yeah.
in the edit. But I remember he said, and we were like, "Oh,
Well,
great."
maybe he's talking about American money that actually never got there.
Yeah, that's what he is talking about. Yeah,
Oh, okay. Yeah, okay. Well, that's a different story, right?
yeah,
Um, but a lot, like that. There was a big hoopla about all these American weapons. In fact, Tucker Carlson, I think, pushed this narrative. All these American weapons that were being siphoned off by the Ukrainians and sold, all that stuff. That's all baloney. That's a Russian talking point. You can trace it right back to the Russians.
maybe, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So,
And I'm sure there's a lot of Russian propaganda.
Yeah.
It's just like, it's like you said, it's impossible to parcel out what is propaganda and, who's starting what. I mean, I'll tell you who wasn't mentioned in the Epstein emails. Many people who work in the Russian government. I mean, you had Putin mentioned because he was trying to get him on the line, but none of the complete debauchery and just horrific things that have been going on, seem to have been happening in the underground of Russia's. I'm not saying it's not happening, because I'm sure it's happening everywhere where these men with this kind of money and power operate,
Yeah.
and they do operate in Russia. But, it's like, it's just a terrible look for the United States right now. And like,
well, it is, and there's another. I use the term "smoking gun" because there's so many of them. Right. It's interesting how much Epstein indirected. What do people call him? I think the German pronunciation is Epstein. Is that what we're saying? Epstein?
yeah, people, it's Epstein.
Or Epstein. I don't know
yeah.
what they're saying, but
They-
Epstein's the correct, the
Right.
German version, right? how much interacting he did with the Putin people affiliated with Putin. I mean, there's tons of emails and stuff
Yeah.
where he's interacting with these guys, and in fact, he's even advising them on how to handle Trump. You know,
Yeah.
that's disturbing, really.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, considering his relationship with Trump.
yeah,
But that's what these guys do. They play both sides. That's why no matter who's elected, it's a win-win for them. You saw the emails that were happening at, like, when Trump started to overtake Hillary in the polls in 2016. You know,
I missed that. No,
oh, there was a ton of, it's looking like Trump's gonna, and of
uh,
course Hillary and Bill, well, particularly Bill, longtime associates and pals with Jeff. They had a great time together, apparently. I'm sure Hillary was not down with it, but Hillary has her own closet that is just riddled with like endless skeletons. I mean, I've done a lot of specials on the Clintons and the Bushes, and so if you're ever bored and you want to watch kind of informational podcasts, I
I'll
really
have
I did a 5-part special on the Bush Clinton crime family, the legacy of those two families.
interesting.
And I honestly, I could have done 25 episodes. I
Yeah.
mean, that's how thick
Mm.
and how far back the corruption goes, especially with the Bushes, who have been involved in the higher ups a lot longer than the Clintons. But the Clintons certainly made up the ground when they got in. But anyway, back to
Remote viewing. Let's go
remote
back to
viewing.
remote viewing.
Like,
It's a much more pleasant topic.
it is, it is. So after everything you've experienced, through remote viewing, how has it changed the way that you think about humanity's future and consciousness?
Um, I would say so. My basic attitude about it, non-detailed, just how I felt about it, hasn't changed at all.
Hmm.
Right? From I was always been interested in ESP and psychic stuff. When I tell my full story, I usually get into this, but I won't give you the full thing here. So, but at one point, I became a bit of a skeptic because I had got involved in a science fair project that had absolutely no results. It totally failed, and so I assumed. I mean, I was a teenager. My critical thinking processes weren't all that great. I had assumed that based on that N of one, that there was nothing to it. Even though I still found it interesting. I'd read science fiction books that involved it and stuff. And so when I'm getting briefed on this program, I signed my NDA, as they call it in the civilian world. Signed my NDA, and I'm being told that they want to recruit me to become a psychic spy, essentially, and they're going to train me to do it. I'm thinking, this stuff really is real.
Wow, yeah, there's a surprise.
So that got me going. But I sort of had the same attitude before. What my experience with remote viewing has done is, of course, filled out a lot of detail I never had. Right? And in fact, I've been able to contribute to that detail, I think, over time through my own experiences and the things I've helped with researching and that kind of thing. And it's helped me understand a little bit better how what you just mentioned might be achieved. And first of all, how important consciousness is. I'm absolutely persuaded that it's not a physical thing. The physicists, even the ones who are somewhat sympathetic, will say, well, we don't know that a future fully filled out a theory of physics won't include ESP and that kind of thing. And while I understand that argument, that's that promissory physicalism, right? We hope someday it will answer it all. I really doubt it's going to get there, ever.
Yeah.
And
Ever?
Well, here's the thing that physics often does is they'll encounter phenomenon that their physics theory can't explain, and so they enlarge the theory so it can explain it. Right? It's kind of a cheat, really, when you think about it. It's kind of cheating, but and if they can figure that out, then that will be interesting. But I think that really does involve a non-physical aspect of the universe, which physics in and of itself, because by definition it has to be concerned with the material world, will not be able to encompass that, at least as part of the underlying physical theory. I think they do need to incorporate it in some way, or they're going to be leaving out half the story, no matter how hard they try.
Agreed.
Yeah.
Absolutely agreed. It's like they're missing out on so much, and I'm just wondering when they're going to figure that out. And it's going to affect the way we understand everything: medicine, life on this planet, every reality. Consciousness it's the only ticket in town as far as I'm concerned. It's truly. I mean, yeah, the oceans are unexplored, but but
Yeah.
consciousness is truly, I think, the last frontier. And I feel like everything and everyone is waiting for us to realize that. And when we do, changing this planet in a way that makes it a little more hospitable from people looking down at us 20,000 feet, that's going to become a lot easier if we do, I hold out hope that evolution will force us to, or we'll just end up, being dug up by another human race in 50,000 years. We're like, we found this plastic device. There's so many of them. We don't know what the hell they are, but this one seems to be in great shape. What are these three? What do you think this signal means? This triangle. It's like, why did they have billions of them?
There's a there's a I guess it's a sort of a graphic novel called Motel of the Mysteries. I don't know if you've seen that.
No.
It's it's very quite nicely executed sketches and stuff. It's a Motel 6 equivalent that's been excavated 1,000 years from now, and they go through and like the ceremonial headdress is this toilet seat around the person's neck, and they tell you, that kind of stuff. And, yeah, it's pretty funny it's kind of like making fun of archaeology because of the things it makes up about past history,
Right. So, no, that's I got to check that out. That sounds hilarious. I mean, I do think consciousness is raising. I think that, if you're going to be somebody who looks on the bright side of things, then you could say that this shit with the files that were released and all this stuff that confirms what a lot of quote conspiracy theorists have been saying is going on, is a good thing, because people need to realize that sadly, tragically, it's not so much a theory. And people need to reconcile that with because I think the biggest thing, the reason why people couldn't believe it before, is because most human beings are pretty good, at heart. They can't imagine people eating, infants and these kind of dark ritualistic sacrifices that are going on, and the use of children in this way. It's like most people cannot even begin to fathom that, let alone believe someone would be capable of it who is like in such a premier position of power. Or so I think that some of this stuff has to come out so that people can demand a better way and try to put a stop to it. Now, if that's going to happen, I don't know how it's going to happen, because, you have a few people relatively who have collected, enough resources to really protect themselves and at all costs. So it's going to take a very unified effort. I don't know, but I do think that, it's like some of this stuff has to come out so that, I mean, are we ever going to change if it doesn't come out? Is there going to be any catalyst for change if the truth is not really exposed? So
it's like trying to heal your finger while the splinter's still in there.
Yes.
It just keeps it reinfecting. So
maybe I'm just being, optimistic, but I feel like maybe that's why this had to happen, so that we can make our way through it and do something about it, because the last people on this planet that should be suffering are the most innocent among us, the children and the kids. But anyway, so my final question for you, my friend, this has been very exciting, and we'll definitely have to do it again, and we'll just have a conversation about anything and everything.
I'm game. You're interesting, and that always makes it worthwhile. Yeah,
appreciate that. For someone who's genuinely curious not chasing spectacle, but like, what's the most important thing that you've learned about remote viewing that you try to or wish maybe people that would understand before they embark on trying to learn it, or maybe that you try to teach them?
So before they embark, I think it's not understand, it's more just be, right? And that is
Mm,
just be open-minded, let go of pre-existing assumptions about what the process is. I mean, there's so many people who come in to take my classes and they either have to suspend previous ideas they had because it gets in the way of what they're learning, the new
mm.
things they're learning, or they have to unlearn stuff
Even harder.
before
Yeah.
they can learn, right? Because there's a lot of, I'd be the first to admit, there's a lot of nonsense out there about remote viewing as well. And not obviously not just remote viewing, but consciousness,
Yeah.
applied consciousness, all this kind of stuff. There's a lot of really good truths, but the internet has increased the noise level
Oh
dramatically.
yeah. Yeah. Like
You
I
can,
saw I saw an ad. It was like, do you want to have sex with aliens? Learn to astral project. Sign up now. I was
yes,
like, what? Wait, what? What? That's how
yes, that's
much?
a good example. That's a good
I was
example.
like,
Yeah.
what the fuck?
So,
Um,
so you need, if you're going to learn remote viewing, at least taught by me, you've got to be willing to let go of something you believed to be true before. It may be something you just temporarily let go of, and then you figure out how it fits in, or maybe something that's actually wrong, and you have to learn to be willing to open up to new
mm,
possibilities, new facts, new information. So,
yeah. All the success I've had in remote viewing has come with my ability to just put myself in a true childlike state
mhm.
and just let everything go as much as I can at every interval, and just allow what um and when I can't do that, I can't remote view for shit. But when I have been able to do that, I've had
Yeah.
some pretty cool experiences where I've been like, what?
Well,
Yeah.
the key is to get in front of your ego, right?
Mm,
It's a very I have for decades been talking about remote viewing being more of a Zen-like process than anything.
mm,
In Zen, the goal is to let go of your agendas, let go of your expectations, let go of investment in the outcome, and focus on the process.
mm,
And if you do that, you'll be successful.
yeah.
But the more you start to worry about, well, what is this thing? What is this thing? The harder it's going to be to actually find out what that thing is. It's almost a paradox, but Zen itself is a sort of a paradox.
Yeah.
So it's very much like that.
There's a great metaphor in what you just said about life too, I think.
Mm.
And a perfect way to kind of button this conversation. But Paul, you still teach, right? Are you
Yeah.
still so? Tell everyone if they want to learn from the man, where they can find you. If I'm not sure if you're on social media or not. Hopefully maybe you're
Well,
too
yeah.
busy for that craziness.
I'm not. I'm not massively into social media,
Hmm.
although I've actually formed an agreement with a. It's kind of a social marketing company, I guess. They're a bit more broad based than that.
Hmm.
That's going to help me with that because I can't promote and engage and create content. It's
Right,
impossible to do both things, right?
right.
And so they're going to help me with that. But I am on Facebook. I have a personal page and just started a business page. Long story there. I had a business page and it disappeared. I won't go into why.
Okay.
Facebook struck again,
Yeah.
um, but I've just done that. I have a YouTube channel called Remote Viewing slash Remote Perception. My website is rviewer.com. That's the letter R in the word viewer. So it's like remote viewer without the emote part.
Ah,
Okay. So rviewer.com. Let me show you this real
sure.
quick.
And we're going to include all those links in the video
Oh,
description.
okay. Well,
Yeah.
this book, The Essential Guide to Remote Viewing,
Oh, nice.
that is intended. First of all, I have no illusions I'm going to get rich off of
Right.
book writing, but this book is intended to fill a gap in the remote viewing literature, which is the beginning part of it,
Mm,
right? And it's a survey thing. It talks about where it came from. It talks about the objections to it and rebuttals to that. It talks about evidence for it. It talks about how to do it. There's 3 chapters in telling you how to do just a fundamental remote thing. And so that's a good go-to place for folks.
Definitely. Awesome.
That book,
I'm going to check it out for sure. Well, for everyone who's watching on YouTube, please don't forget to hit the subscribe button. We're trying to gain our subscribership against a lot of algorithmic suppression. This has been a very algorithmic friendly conversation for the most part. So we got that going for us anyway, Paul. But you know, if you're listening on Spotify or iTunes, please drop us if you enjoyed the conversation 5 stars. We could use them, and then we have a Facebook page where you can always see current releases, and we post every day. And of course, I have a Patreon page if you guys want to support my work. Check that out. It's all Far Out with Faust. And thank you guys so much for being in. Paul, it was an absolute pleasure, man. It was a great conversation, a lot of fun. We'll definitely do it again, man. We'll just have a no holds barred conversation, which will be great.
You're nothing if you're not entertaining. So
thank you, brother. I appreciate that. We'll be in touch with you, let you know when all this comes out and all that.
Great, thanks you.
Man.
I'll pass it around to Mike.
Appreciate it. Have a great day, man.
You too. Thanks.